Passengers on Flight 247 that morning were thinking about coffee, emails, or the meetings waiting for them on the ground. None of them expected the moment when two A-10 warplanes would suddenly appear outside the window, flying so close that people could see the pilots' helmets through the glass. At first, the cabin filled with whispers, nervous laughter, and the usual phone cameras rising into the air. But then something happened that no one on that aircraft would ever forget. The pilots of those war machines, trained to respond only to military commands, suddenly dipped their wings in a precise mid-air salute. And they did it for one quiet passenger sitting in seat 19A, a woman who had boarded like everyone else, carrying nothing but a small backpack and a tired smile. A woman whose call sign hadn't been spoken in years. Until that moment. Before we begin this unbelievable story, take 1 second to subscribe, because the stories you hear on this channel aren't just about drama or mystery. They're about the extraordinary people hidden among us every single day. And sometimes the person who changes everything is sitting quietly right beside you. Morning sky above the Midwest was impossibly calm, the kind of blue that pilots quietly appreciate because it promises an uneventful flight. Flight 247 had lifted off just 40 minutes earlier, climbing smoothly through thin clouds before leveling out at cruising altitude. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was predictable, overhead vents humming softly, passengers scrolling on phones. A flight attendant moving down the aisle with coffee that smelled stronger than the airplane fuel outside. Emily Carter sat at seat 19A beside the window, watching the clouds slide slowly beneath the wing. She looked like any other traveler, mid-30s, simple clothes, hair tied back in a loose knot that suggested she'd packed in a hurry. The only unusual thing about her was the way she looked at the sky, not casually, not like a passenger enjoying the view, but with the quiet familiarity of someone who understood it. Across the aisle, a young man named Tyler had already fallen asleep with headphones on, while behind Emily, a businessman argued quietly into his phone about a delayed contract. No one paid attention to the woman at the window. No one noticed how her eyes followed the horizon the way pilots do. Up in the cockpit, Captain Harris was scanning his instruments while his co-pilot ran routine checks. "Airspace looks clear all the way through Nebraska," the co-pilot said casually. Harris nodded, sipping lukewarm coffee. "Good. I'd like one flight this week that doesn't surprise me." That wish lasted exactly 6 minutes. The first sign something unusual was happening appeared on the radar screen, a small pair of fast-moving signals approaching from the southwest. Harris leaned closer to the display. "Military traffic?" he muttered. The co-pilot checked the frequency logs. "Looks like it. But they're not scheduled anywhere near this corridor." Before either of them could say more, the aircraft's communication radio crackled with a sharp transmission that sounded clipped and professional. "Commercial Flight 247, maintain current heading and altitude." Harris frowned. The voice didn't identify itself, which military pilots usually did. "Unidentified aircraft, this is Flight 247. Please state your designation." There was a pause, and then the reply came with calm authority. "Flight 247, continue course. You'll have visual contact shortly." Harris looked through the windshield, and then he saw them. Two gray shapes slicing through the sky with the unmistakable blunt-nosed silhouette of a A-10 Thunderbolt, i.e., the famous ground attack aircraft known among pilots as the Warthog. They were approaching fast but controlled, holding perfect formation. Harris let out a low whistle. Well, that's definitely new. Back in the cabin, the first passenger to notice them was a teenage girl seated near the wing. She gasped loudly enough that half the row turned to look. "Oh my God! Are those fighter jets?" Phones appeared instantly. People leaned toward the windows, murmuring with a mixture of excitement and unease. The A-10s glided closer until they were clearly visible outside the windows' gray metal bodies streaked with sunlight, engines roaring silently through the thick glass. Someone laughed nervously. "Are we being escorted or something?" But Emily Carter didn't laugh. The moment she saw the aircraft, something changed in her expression. Not fear, recognition. The lead A-10 drifted slightly closer to the passenger jet's wing, steady as if it were parked in the sky. Inside its cockpit, the pilot glanced sideways through his canopy and then froze. "Control. Confirm target aircraft tail number." Ground control responded immediately. "Tail number confirmed. Maintain escort until identification verified." The pilot narrowed his eyes. Something about the silhouette of the woman in seat 19A was visible through the window reflection. Something impossibly familiar. He switched radio frequencies. "Falcon 1 to Falcon 2. You seeing what I'm seeing?" The second A-10 pilot angled slightly upward to get a clearer view into the passenger cabin windows. For 3 seconds he said nothing. Then his voice returned quiet, stunned. "That can't be right." Back inside the cabin, the passengers were still reacting with amazement, unaware that the two heavily armed aircraft beside them had just stopped focusing on the plane itself and started focusing on a single passenger. Emily's gaze stayed fixed on the lead A-10. She tilted her head slightly, studying the jet's wing markings the way someone might recognize an old uniform. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, as if a memory had brushed past her unexpectedly. The businessman behind her leaned forward. "Hey, do you know why they're flying so close?" Emily shook her head gently. "No," she said quietly. But high above the clouds, inside the cockpit of the lead A-10, the pilot suddenly felt his pulse hammering. He stared again through the cabin window reflection, and then whispered a name he hadn't spoken in nearly 8 years. "Control. I need confirmation on one passenger." The radio hissed. "State request." The pilot swallowed. "Possible visual on former squadron leader." Silence filled the channel for a moment. Then Control replied slowly, "That's impossible." But the pilot kept staring at seat 19A, because the woman sitting there wasn't just another passenger. She was the pilot who had once led them through the most dangerous mission of their careers. The one they all believed had died long ago. And if he was right, the quiet woman watching the clouds outside that airplane window had a call sign that every A-10 pilot in the Western Command still remembered. A call sign that had once meant survival when nothing else could. The pilot's hand tightened on the control stick as he made a decision that would confuse everyone listening on the radio. "Falcon 2. Prepare salute formation." The second pilot hesitated. "You're sure?" The reply came with absolute certainty. "If that's who I think it is." She earned it. And inside seat 19A, Emily Carter watched as the lead A-10 slowly rolled its wings. The universal airborne gesture of respect among combat pilots. A salute, not to the airplane, not to the airline crew, but to her. A moment the cabin stayed quiet, the way a room sometimes freezes before people fully understand what they are seeing. The A-10 outside the window had rolled its wings slowly, the motion precise and deliberate, a movement that most passengers interpreted as a simple maneuver. But to anyone who understood military aviation, it meant something very specific. It was respect. A salute. The young man sitting across the aisle leaned closer to the glass, pressing his palm against the window as if he could get a better view through the thick acrylic barrier. "Did you see that?" He whispered to no one in particular. The jet just dipped its wings. Phones were still raised, recording the strange moment, but the excitement in the cabin had begun shifting into curiosity. People were asking the same question in different ways. Why were 2 heavily armed warplanes flying escort beside a routine passenger flight? And why did one of them just salute? Emily Carter remained perfectly still in seat 19A. Her eyes followed the lead, A-10 as it stabilized again beside the aircraft wing. The sunlight caught the gray metal fuselage, And for a brief instant, the numbers painted beneath the cockpit flashed clearly in the reflection of the passenger window. Emily inhaled slowly. She recognized those markings, not the specific aircraft, but the squadron style. A memory stirred in the back of her mind, one she had spent years carefully burying beneath ordinary life. Across the aisle, the flight attendant had paused with the beverage cart halfway down the row, staring out the window like everyone else. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said cautiously, forcing a reassuring smile, "there's no cause for alarm. It appears we're simply being accompanied by military aircraft." Someone in the back laughed nervously. Accompanied? That's one way to say it. In the cockpit, Captain Harris was less relaxed. His hands rested lightly on the controls, but his eyes kept shifting between the windshield and the radar screen. The A-10s held position flawlessly, matching speed and altitude with almost casual precision. Military pilots were trained for this, but it was still unusual to see them this close without prior coordination. "You ever had an escort before?" Harris asked his co-pilot quietly. The co-pilot shook his head. "Not unless we're talking about air shows." The radio crackled again. "Flight 247, maintain current altitude." Harris frowned. "You're still not identifying your unit," he replied into the microphone. "Protocol says you need to," but the transmission ended abruptly. The co-pilot leaned closer to the windshield. "Look at the lead jet." Outside, the A-10 had drifted slightly closer again, aligning almost perfectly beside the passenger windows. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't threatening. If anything, it looked intentional, as if the pilot was trying to see something or someone inside the aircraft. High above the clouds, inside the cockpit of that lead A-10, Major Daniel Hayes could feel the adrenaline pushing through his veins. His helmet visor reflected the bright sky while his eyes stayed locked on the row of passenger windows along the commercial jet's fuselage. "Falcon 2, he said over the radio, his voice steady despite the storm of memories in his mind. "Adjust 5 meters starboard. I need a clearer angle." The second pilot responded immediately, nudging his aircraft slightly upward. "You really think it's her?" Hayes didn't answer right away, because even now, part of him couldn't believe what he was seeing. 8 years earlier, the name Emily Carter had been spoken across every briefing room in their command. She had been the youngest squadron leader the unit had ever seen, a pilot whose instincts in the air bordered on legendary. Her call sign had become almost mythological among A-10 crews. Valkyrie. She had earned it during a mission in the mountains of northern Afghanistan, when she flew through anti-aircraft fire so intense that 3 other aircraft had already turned back. She didn't. Instead, she guided her entire formation through the canyon, destroyed the enemy convoy below, and still brought every aircraft home. That mission alone had made her famous. But it wasn't the mission people remembered most. It was the last one. Hayes's fingers tightened slightly around the control stick as the memory resurfaced. The operation had been classified, but everyone in the squadron knew the outcome. Emily Carter's aircraft had disappeared during a night engagement near the border. Radar contact lost. Wreckage never recovered. The official report called it a presumed fatality. The military had held a quiet ceremony. Her call sign was retired, and every pilot who had flown under her command carried the same unresolved question: what had really happened in those final minutes before she vanished from the sky? Hayes had accepted that answer for 8 years. Until now. Because the woman sitting beside the passenger window of Flight 247 looked exactly like the pilot they had buried without a body. Same posture. Same calm expression. Even the way she studied the horizon was unmistakable. "Control," Hayes said finally into the radio. "Request passenger manifest for Flight 247. The voice from command responded cautiously. "State reason for request." Hayes hesitated for half a second. Then he spoke the name. Emily Carter. Inside the passenger cabin, Emily shifted slightly in her seat. The businessman behind her leaned forward again, curiosity getting the better of him. "You don't seem surprised," he said quietly. Emily gave a small, polite smile. "I suppose I just trust the pilots know what they're doing." But her eyes drifted back to the A-10 outside the window. She could almost imagine the pilot's face behind the reflective visor. A strange feeling tugged at her chest, familiar and distant at the same time. Somewhere deep in her memory, a voice echoed faintly. "Valkyrie, you're leading this run." Emily blinked and looked away from the window. The memory dissolved before she could catch it completely. In the cockpit of the A-10, Hayes finally received the reply from control. "Passenger manifest confirms an Emily Carter aboard flight 247. Hayes felt his heart skip once. Age? 36. That matched perfectly. Hayes exhaled slowly. "Any military history listed?" A pause followed. Then control answered. "Negative. Civilian occupation listed as aviation safety consultant." Hayes stared through the glass canopy at the woman sitting in seat 19A. "That's her," he whispered. The second pilot's voice returned over the radio. "Major, if she's alive, why the hell would the military list her as dead?" Hayes didn't know. But one thing was certain. Emily Carter had been one of the best pilots the A-10 program had ever produced. If she was sitting quietly on a commercial flight, pretending to be a civilian, there had to be a reason. Back in the passenger cabin, the murmuring had grown louder. Passengers were pointing phones toward the window, some laughing in excitement, while others looked uneasy about how close the warplanes were flying. The young man across the aisle leaned toward Emily again. "I swear that pilot just looked straight at you," he said. Emily forced another calm smile. "Maybe he's just checking the wing clearance." But at that exact moment, the lead A-10 moved again. Slowly, deliberately. It rolled its wings a second time. This time the motion was even more precise, almost ceremonial. Inside the cockpit, Hayes spoke quietly into his microphone. "Valkyrie, if that's really you, welcome back." And in seat 19A, Emily Carter felt a sudden chill run through her body as the distant echo of a forgotten call sign brushed against her memory once again. Second salute from the A-10 hung in the air like a silent message written across the sky. Most passengers inside Flight 247 were still trying to understand what they were seeing, but Emily Carter felt something far deeper than curiosity stirring inside her. The movement of the aircraft, the angle of the wings, the precision of the formation, it was a language she once knew better than anyone. For years she had tried to bury that part of her life, to live quietly after the mission that had ended everything. The official story said her aircraft had been lost during a classified operation, and for the world that was the end of Captain Emily Carter. But the truth had been more complicated. She survived the crash in a remote mountain valley after her aircraft was struck during a night strike mission. Severely injured and cut off from communication, she spent days alone before a covert rescue team found her. When she finally returned, intelligence officers made a decision that changed her life forever. The mission she had been flying carried information too sensitive to ever become public. Her survival meant questions would follow questions about what happened that night and what she had seen. So the military did the unthinkable. They closed her file, declared her lost, and quietly helped her disappear into civilian life. Emily agreed because she was tired of war, tired of watching friends vanish into the same sky she once loved. For 8 years she kept that promise. No uniforms, no call signs, no flying. But high above the clouds that morning, 2 A-10 pilots had just recognized something the world had forgotten. Inside the lead aircraft, Major Daniel, Hayes felt a strange mixture of pride and disbelief as he looked through the passenger window again. There she was, alive, sitting calmly like any other traveler. The woman who once led them through fire without hesitation. He switched frequencies one final time. "Control, escort complete." The voice on the ground sounded confused. "Escort complete? You were never assigned one." Hayes smiled slightly beneath his helmet. "We were today." With that, the two A-10s slowly banked away, engines roaring as they turned back toward the open sky. As they passed the commercial jet one last time, both aircraft dipped their wings together in a perfect synchronized salute before accelerating into the distance. Inside the cabin, the passengers erupted into excited chatter. Phones replayed the moment again and again. But Emily simply watched the empty sky where the jets had disappeared. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a quiet smile. Because somewhere out there, the pilot she once led still remembered the call sign she thought the world had forgotten. Valkyrie, and sometimes respect doesn't need headlines, medals, or recognition. Sometimes it happens silently, thousands of feet above the clouds. Message for the audience: this story reminded you that heroes often walk among us unnoticed. Take a moment to subscribe and share this video. Because behind ordinary faces are extraordinary stories waiting to be told. And sometimes the quiet person sitting next to you might have once carried a call sign that changed lives in the sky.